A secret has festered in the heart of the Chicago Police Department for far too long, hidden behind a crisp uniform and a cruel smirk. Officer Martin Harding carried his badge with pride, but behind that polished exterior lurked a deep-seated racism that no one dared to challenge until now. In an explosive twist of fate, his latest victim, a determined black woman, emerges from the shadows in a position he never expected, the newly appointed head of internal affairs. This is the story of how a man's long-standing prejudice collapses under the weight of justice and how true power meets its ultimate reckoning. Chicago thrummed with energy at dawn. The towering skyline, anchored by the majestic Willis Tower, revealed a city that wore its ambition on every street corner. Restaurants and cafes sprang to life, the clatter of dishes blending with the morning rush of trains. Lake Michigan's cool breeze whispered promises of opportunity. But beyond the scenic lakefront, a more complicated truth sprawled across neighborhood lines. Under the gleaming high-rises were pockets of distrust in the police system, rumors that were never fully substantiated but always present in hushed conversations. Officer Martin Harding knew those streets well. Having spent 15 years patrolling some of the roughest neighborhoods, he liked to think he was the embodiment of law enforcement. He had the handshake of a politician, the crisp salute of a soldier, and a smile that could charm even the most jaded city council member. Yet behind that cultivated facade lurked a layered prejudice, a viewpoint shaped by his upbringing, validated by the worst examples of humanity he encountered on his beats. Martin's world was black and white, with little room for compassion if you happened to fall on the wrong side of his moral ledger. In public, Martin was the good cop. He visited community centers, spoke at local high schools, and volunteered to read to children at the public library during summer programs. The newspapers occasionally showcased him as a beacon of the Chicago Police Department. But in private, Martin's personal brand of racism reared its ugly head in subtle ways, a sneer at a colleague of color, a mocking laugh when a suspect with brown skin insisted on their innocence, a quiet suggestion that certain neighborhoods or certain people just asked for trouble. Few had the audacity to complain about him. After all, Martin Harding had connections. He came from a family of legal professionals. His uncle had been a judge at the Cook County Circuit Court. His cousin was an influential attorney in the city. Combine that with Martin's carefully cultivated image, and it was no surprise that grievances against him rarely stuck. He was a man who knew how to slip free of accountability with a polished grin and a carefully drafted statement. True, colleagues whispered about his questionable conduct, but no one could ever prove anything. And who would stand up to him anyway? What no one imagined, least of all Martin, was that a spectre from a case he once dismissed as inconsequential would soon step into the limelight. This spectre was Ebony Townsend, a black woman from the South Side who had experienced Martin's prejudice firsthand. At the time, Ebony had been a victim, but she was no longer the powerless bystander Martin remembered. Now, she held a different kind of power, one that could either save or condemn a career. Because Ebony Townsend was about to become the new head of internal affairs for the Chicago Police Department, and she was on a mission to cleanse the system of the rot festering within it. Martin sat in his squad car outside a dingy convenience store on a Tuesday night, boredom gnawing at him. The chatter on the radio was monotonous, a petty theft here, a minor scuffle there. These late shifts often brought out the bleakness in him, as if each hour chipped away at his carefully orchestrated facade. He had learned to cope by indulging his darker impulses, stereotyping passers-by and ridiculing them under his breath, sometimes even making snide remarks over the radio to amuse his inner circle of like-minded officers. But Martin's cynicism wasn't born overnight. It was cultivated over years in a household that reinforced narrow views. His father, a retired army officer, was outwardly respectable but harbored strong biases, especially toward African Americans and immigrants. Mealtime conversations were peppered with casual slurs, the kind that made Martin believe these words were normal. Though Martin's mother tried to temper this atmosphere, she never wholly succeeded. As Martin entered the police academy, he knew how to play the game, how to charm superiors, how to appear just bright-eyed enough to get ahead. His instructors praised him for his discipline and crisp execution of routines. They never saw the venom that snaked through his thoughts. And in the early stages, perhaps Martin himself wasn't fully aware of how dangerously these beliefs would manifest. Within the first few years on the force, Martin had already been involved in incidents that raised eyebrows. There were allegations of unnecessary force, primarily against suspects of color. Although every case ended in Martin's favor, thanks to strategic maneuvering by the department and supportive testimonies from a handful of loyal buddies, the accusations piled up. Each exoneration only emboldened him further, sealing his belief that he could get away with nearly anything. He began to interpret his uniform as a shield that protected him from consequence. Outside the uniform, Martin cultivated a respectable presence. He attended church events, donated to local charities, and even participated in the Special Olympics. The Chicago Tribune once wrote a glowing profile titled "The Compassionate Side of Chicago's Finest," featuring Martin beaming alongside children from diverse backgrounds at a fundraising event. But behind that photograph was a man who often told racist jokes among trusted peers, who undermined minority colleagues in subtle but powerful ways, and who never once hesitated to use harsh language when he believed no one was listening. This dual persona found strange affirmation in everyday life. His seniors at the precinct saw him as a reliable officer who consistently brought in results: low crime rates in his district, a high record of arrests. The public saw him as an emblem of community service. But the people who crossed him, especially minorities who lived in the neighborhoods he patrolled, knew a different story. They saw an officer who demanded respect but offered none, a man whose handshake came with a sneer, whose eyes held a contempt that words could not adequately capture. That was Martin Harding in a nutshell, the star cop with a hidden moral debt. And unbeknownst to him, the final reckoning was closer than he could ever imagine. Before Ebony Townsend's name echoed through the corridors of the Chicago Police Department as head of internal affairs, it resonated in a very different context. She was once just another statistic, a black teenager from a struggling neighborhood who had a few run-ins with law enforcement. At least, that was how some people chose to label her. The reality was that Ebony grew up in a small apartment in Inglewood, an area often stigmatized for high crime and poverty. Her mother, Yvonne, worked double shifts as a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital, and her father had passed away from cancer when Ebony was only 9. Despite these challenges, Ebony had an irrepressible spirit. At 13, she volunteered at a local youth program, tutoring younger children in math and reading. At 15, she caught the eye of a high school counselor who recognized her leadership potential and recommended her for a leadership camp. Still, Ebony never fully escaped the biases that came with living in Inglewood. She was often treated with suspicion whenever she ventured outside her neighborhood. Shop owners would follow her around their stores. Teachers would sometimes assume she was behind any disruption in class, even when she wasn't. Early encounters with the police, including Martin Harding, only cemented her belief that the system viewed her as guilty until proven innocent. Years ago, when Ebony was 17, a friend's misguided decision pulled her into the orbit of Officer Martin Harding. Her friend had stolen a car for a joyride, and Ebony happened to be in the passenger seat. They were pulled over, and Ebony cooperated fully. She tried to explain she hadn't known the car was stolen, that she had just hopped in after her friend offered a ride. But, to Martin Harding, Ebony was just another black kid making excuses. He ignored her pleas, refused to hear her story, and delivered a scathing monologue about kids like her. That experience lit a fire in Ebony's heart. Though she spent an anxious night at the station, the charges against her were eventually dropped once the friend confessed. But Ebony never forgot the searing look of contempt on Martin's face. Something about the way he addressed her, dismissive, patronizing, brimming with bigotry, stuck with her. It became a motivator, a reason to prove him and others like him wrong. Fiercely determined, Ebony threw herself into her studies. She earned a scholarship to John Marshall Law School in Chicago, focusing on criminal justice. While studying, she interned with community-oriented law firms, aiming to help reform policing practices from within. Upon passing the bar, she joined the city attorney's office, where her passion for justice and reform only grew. She became involved in drafting guidelines for police accountability, forging alliances with community leaders and other government agencies. Her reputation soared. Eventually, her work caught the attention of top officials in City Hall. And so, the teenager, once handcuffed by Martin Harding, whose pleas he had ignored, whose dignity he had carelessly trampled, was about to become something he never anticipated, a central figure with the power to scrutinize and, if necessary, dismantle the dark corners of the Chicago Police Department. When the department superintendent, Manuel Ortega, announced that a special commission would be formed to address rising complaints of police misconduct, the entire force took notice. A surge of rumors spread through the precincts, and tongues wagged about who would lead this new initiative. Several names were tossed around: veterans in the force, lawyers with reputations for integrity, even ex-FBI agents. But when Ortega confirmed that the new head of internal affairs would be Ebony Townsend, skepticism hung in the air. Martin Harding heard it first from his partner, Officer Raymond Knox. Knox, an older officer who maintained a neutral stance on departmental gossip, walked into the break room one afternoon and nonchalantly dropped the news. Martin froze mid-sip of his coffee, nearly choking when he recognized the name. Surely it couldn't be the same Ebony Townsend, he thought. The notion sent a chill through him, memories flooding back of that traffic stop so many years ago. He had never forgotten the encounter, if only because Ebony's unwavering gaze had unnerved him. For Martin, the news felt like an omen. He remembered Ebony as a resourceful, determined teenager who had tried to assert her innocence, even when he was doing everything to ignore her. He had no idea what had happened to her afterward, but her sudden reappearance in a position of authority threatened to upend his carefully controlled universe. It was as if fate itself had conspired to deliver a karmic blow. Martin tried to brush it off in front of Knox, forcing a laugh as if the name meant nothing to him. But the unease crept into his every movement that day. He fumbled with his keys, snapped at a rookie officer for no reason, and took early leave under the guise of a migraine. He needed time to think, to strategize, to figure out how to handle this predicament if Ebony chose to target him. The next week was tense. The roll call sessions and daily briefings took on a new undertone. Talk of accountability and reforms echoed in the precinct halls. Some officers welcomed change, having grown tired of the negative spotlight cast on them whenever a scandal broke. Others grumbled quietly, anxious that the new commission would expose skeletons in their closets. Martin tried to project calm, but inside he felt cornered. A document circulated, detailing Ebony Townsend's credentials and mission statement. She was unflinching in her condemnation of misconduct, vowing to restore public trust by holding police officers accountable to the highest ethical standards. She emphasized the importance of empathy, fairness, and the invaluable relationship between officers and the communities they served. It sounded noble, but to Martin it felt like a direct threat. He scoured every line for a hint that she was specifically coming for him, but nothing was explicit. Yet, the seeds of suspicion had been planted, and Martin began to sense that his past was no longer safe. He could almost feel Ebony's gaze on him, even before she officially took office. The uneasy whispers in the corridors foretold that a new chapter was opening in the Chicago Police Department, a chapter that might unravel Martin's carefully hidden prejudices for all to see. Ebony's first official day as head of internal affairs arrived with both anticipation and trepidation in the building. The lobby bustled with reporters from local stations, WGN, ABC7, and even the Chicago Tribune's crime beat journalists. Ebony stepped out of the elevator in a crisp navy pantsuit, her hair in a neat bun, her expression radiating confidence, yet tempered by solemn responsibility. Flashbulbs popped, and microphones surrounded her as she graciously thanked everyone for their interest in her new role. She reiterated her commitment to transparent investigations, fair practices, and stronger community relations. Martin Harding watched from a distance, standing behind a group of other officers. He wore his standard uniform, badge reflecting the fluorescent lights in the hallway. A weight grew in his chest as he confirmed it was indeed the same Ebony Townsend he'd encountered years ago. She looked different, more polished, more self-assured, but the determination in her eyes was unmistakable. It reminded him of that teenage girl who refused to cower beneath his authority. After the press interviews, Ebony made her way down the corridor toward her new office. Flanked by a couple of administrative aides, Martin could have slipped away, pretended to be busy somewhere else, but some morbid curiosity urged him to stay. Maybe he wanted to see if Ebony would recognize him. Maybe he wanted to gauge how much she remembered and how personal this vendetta might be. In the hush that fell as she approached, Ebony's gaze swept across the assembled officers. When her eyes landed on Martin, there was a flicker of recognition, a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it really was. Martin felt his throat go dry. Ebony offered a polite nod, her face betraying no overt emotion. That simple acknowledgement told him she remembered. She remembered everything, and yet she gave nothing away, gliding past him as if he were just another officer. Martin's pulse hammered. He didn't know whether to be relieved or alarmed. Her composure was almost more unsettling than outright hostility. He half expected her to march right up to him, demand an explanation for his past actions, and humiliate him in front of everyone. But she did none of that. She simply acknowledged him, moved on, and began her day a silent statement of her power. Martin couldn't help but wonder if she was just biding her time, collecting evidence, strategizing how to dismantle his career with surgical precision. Later that day, Ebony convened her first meeting with high-ranking officers and the department's legal counsel. Martin wasn't required to attend, so he spent the afternoon in a haze of anxiety. His mind raced with possibilities. Could she have documents linking him to those old complaints? He knew the department's internal affairs files weren't easily accessible, but Ebony now had the keys to that kingdom. For the first time in his career, Martin felt the intangible grip of accountability tightening around him, a sensation he neither recognized nor welcomed. In that pivotal first encounter, no words were exchanged between them, but the tension that sparked in the hallway spoke volumes. Their stories, once separate, were now on a collision course. And for Martin Harding, the silent promise of retribution loomed like a gathering storm. For the first few weeks of Ebony's tenure, she quietly went about her duties, reviewing open cases and auditing past complaints that never received proper attention. She insisted on diving into the archives, poring over musty folders from a decade or more ago. Her subordinates soon learned that Ebony was not satisfied with superficial conclusions. She wanted a holistic view of the department's history of disciplinary issues, patterns in complaints, and how certain cases were swept under the rug. The Chicago Police Department's digital records were labyrinthine, with thousands of incident reports and disciplinary notes. Ebony systematically cross-referenced data, repeated allegations of excessive force, suspicious patterns of missing dash-cam footage, internal memos that seemed hastily edited. In doing so, she discovered a constellation of problematic officers, individuals who had skated by with nothing more than mild reprimands. Among them, Martin Harding's name appeared frequently. His record was a smattering of red flags, masked by official justifications and supportive statements from fellow officers. She recalled her personal experience with Martin, but Ebony refused to let it cloud her professional judgment. If she was to bring meaningful change, she needed evidence that went beyond her singular encounter. So she combed through each complaint, each witness statement, and each closed case. A pattern emerged. Martin often targeted young black men and women for minor infractions, sometimes escalating situations that should have been resolved calmly. Yet each time, the final report painted Martin as the hero, the reasonable officer dealing with uncooperative suspects. Ebony also noticed that after certain controversial arrests, Martin's file contained exculpatory memos authored by his friends in the department. They cited him as an exemplary officer, showing commendable initiative. The deeper she dug, the more it became evident that Martin had cultivated a small network of allies officers who backed up his stories in internal reviews, supervisors who lost evidence that might have implicated him. To Ebony, this wasn't just about one racist cop, it was about a culture of complicity. Along the way, Ebony built her own network of principled officers who wanted to see reform. They shared stories of cases that didn't add up, incidents that reeked of cover-ups. Some had witnessed Martin's darker side firsthand, but were too afraid to speak out. Ebony reassured them that the new administration was serious about protecting whistleblowers. The fear in their voices was palpable. Decades of intimidation and unspoken rules don't disappear overnight. Despite her progress, Ebony also faced resistance. Anonymous notes landed on her desk, warning her to tread lightly if she valued her career. In one instance, her car's tires were slashed in the station parking lot. That particular threat only fueled her resolve. Ebony requested additional surveillance in the parking lots and made sure to keep her staff tight-knit. Superintendent Ortega, though publicly supportive, appeared hesitant to wage war against entrenched departmental politics. He cautioned Ebony to proceed methodically, as any misstep could bring the wrath of the police union and local politicians who thrived on the department's old guard. But Ebony was undeterred. Day after day, she unearthed more evidence enough to lay a foundation for a sweeping investigation that would rattle every corner of the police force. Martin Harding's name kept surfacing, each time tethered to a story of intimidation or racial bias. Ebony understood that confronting him alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to crack open the entire system that allowed such behavior to persist. Still, she had to be meticulous. If she pressed too hard without an airtight case, she risked inflaming an already tense environment, potentially giving Martin and his allies time to destroy records or manipulate witnesses. Slowly, she orchestrated a plan that combined her legal expertise with her new authority. It wouldn't be a simple confrontation. It would be a carefully executed takedown, one that Martin Harding wouldn't see coming until the evidence was too overwhelming to refute. Martin Harding felt the walls closing in. In the weeks following Ebony's arrival, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted in subtle yet telling ways. Old alliances grew tense. Officers who once joked openly with him now offered polite nods, as if frightened their association with Martin might taint them. Even the brass, who used to sing his praises, seemed cautious. The mere mention of Ebony Townsend or her investigative team sent ripples of unease through the department. Anxious and angry, Martin played it cool on the surface. He continued his daily patrols, writing traffic tickets, making arrests when necessary. But inside, he was a storm of emotions. His partner, Raymond Knox, picked up on his mood. During a routine call, Martin snapped at a civilian with a level of aggression Knox had never witnessed before. Knox pulled him aside afterward, urging Martin to keep a level head. Martin almost lost his temper at Knox, but he reined it in. He couldn't afford open displays of hostility. One afternoon, Martin received a tip from a sympathetic desk sergeant. Ebony's team had requested Martin's old case files, including internal memos and dash-cam footage logs. It was a massive request, spanning nearly his entire career. Martin's blood ran cold. He realized Ebony was gathering ammunition. The immediate question wasn't just about how to survive the inquiry, but how to counterstrike. He weighed whether to destroy evidence, but that was risky. Digital footprints were everywhere, and Ebony's team would likely notice if something vanished. Instead, Martin focused on spinning a narrative of his own, claiming Ebony had a vendetta against him due to a past encounter, thereby framing himself as the victim of a biased investigation. He confided in a few close allies officers he'd helped in the past, who owed him favors. They discussed ways to plant doubt about Ebony's impartiality, leaking rumors that she was personally targeting white officers or that she held a deep-seated grudge from her teenage years. A few quiet phone calls to local tabloid reporters started the rumor mill churning. Martin aimed to delegitimize Ebony in the public eye before she could complete her investigation. The plan was underhanded, but Martin believed he had no choice. Meanwhile, Ebony's own circle felt the pressure. Whistleblowers who had come forward reported anonymous threats. Some key witnesses hesitated to testify, fearing professional retaliation or worse. Ebony responded by ramping up protective measures, confidential meeting locations, digital encryption of sensitive files, and close coordination with a circle of city attorneys. She reminded her team daily that their work was vital for the soul of the department. The city was watching, and if they failed, it would send a grim message to those seeking accountability. Despite the mounting opposition, Ebony found surprising allies in the community. Grassroots organizations, civil rights advocates, and local church leaders rallied to her cause. They held peaceful protests and pressed city officials to support her reforms. Public sentiment began to sway in Ebony's favor. Superintendent Ortega, who'd been tentative, now saw that ignoring Ebony's efforts could become a political liability. He offered her more resources, albeit still with caution. As tensions grew, Martin found himself in an ever-tightening circle. The old ways of bullying and intimidation no longer worked. People were emboldened by Ebony's presence. Each day brought another headache, a new complaint from a civilian who claimed Martin used abusive language, a leaked memo that contradicted an older statement, or a local radio host calling for deeper scrutiny of his record. Martin felt the simmering anger within him surge. He could almost taste the desperation. And when desperation took hold, he knew men like him were capable of anything. Determined to solidify her evidence, Ebony orchestrated a sting operation, covert, meticulous, and backed by enough legal safeguards to withstand any counterattack. The plan revolved around leveraging an officer who had grown disillusioned with Martin's methods. Officer Carla Diaz, a former ally of Martin's, had become increasingly uncomfortable with his biases and was privately appalled at how often complaints against him were mishandled. Ebony met with Carla in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of the city. No uniforms, no official vehicles, just two women chatting over coffee in a corner booth. Carla confessed she'd witnessed Martin fabricate details in his incident reports, intimidating suspects to sign false statements or discouraging them from filing formal grievances. She had stayed silent out of fear for her job and the backlash from her colleagues. But the new wave of accountability Ebony brought gave Carla a sense of hope. She finally felt safe enough to come forward. That afternoon, Ebony laid out the stakes. They needed a direct link, an undeniable piece of audio or video that captured Martin's misconduct in real time. Carla agreed to wear a hidden microphone for their next patrol together. She was, after all, occasionally assigned as Martin's temporary partner when Knox was off. It was a dangerous move. If Martin discovered it, the fallout for Carla could be catastrophic, potentially even life-threatening given Martin's desperation. But Carla stood firm. "This has to end," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and conviction. A week later, Carla found herself in the passenger seat of Martin's cruiser, her nerves on edge. She swallowed hard, recalling Ebony's instructions to keep calm, remain natural, and above all, never let Martin suspect anything. As they set off on routine calls, Carla prayed silently. The day dragged on without incident, but as evening approached, a call came in about a supposed disturbance at a local convenience store. Witnesses described a black teenager accused of shoplifting. Martin's eyes lit up with a vindictive glint that Carla recognized all too well. They arrived at the scene to find a frightened teenage boy cornered by the store owner. The boy insisted he was innocent, that he only had money for a soda. Martin, however, wasn't listening. He pushed the boy against the wall, barking orders and shoving the teen's hands behind his back. Carla's heart pounded. She saw the exact scenario Ebony had described countless times, Martin jumping to extreme measures, ignoring any reasonable attempt to de-escalation. As Martin tightened the handcuffs, the boy cried out. The store's security footage would later show him offering to empty his pockets, but Martin was too caught up in his aggression to pay attention. Through the hidden mic, Carla captured Martin spewing racist epithets under his breath, berating the teen about people like you, always stealing. The store owner, initially looking for police assistance, now watched in horror as Martin's hostility escalated. Carla tried to interject, suggesting they check the kids' pockets or review the store's camera footage, but Martin snarled at her to step back. Eventually, Carla persuaded Martin to step outside, allowing her to retrieve the teen's wallet from his pocket. Inside was exactly the amount needed for the soda. There was no stolen merchandise, no reason for an arrest. The store owner, realizing the mistake, apologized profusely. The flustered teen trembled, tears streaming down his face. Martin, however, refused to let go of his narrative. He forced the teen into the cruiser, planning to bring him in for disturbing the peace or resisting arrest. His attempts to fabricate a charge rang hollow to Carla, and she prayed that the microphone had picked up enough. She felt a surge of relief and guilt when they finally left the scene. Relief because the evidence was damning. Guilt because she had just seen another young life traumatized by the very institution meant to protect him. When Carla reported back to Ebony, her hands were still shaking, but Ebony's expression mixed shock with satisfaction. They had captured Martin in his truest form, unbridled, unapologetic, and thoroughly corrupt. The final piece of the puzzle was in their possession, and soon Ebony would unleash it in a way that even Martin Harding's allies couldn't spin. Ebony waited until the next department-wide meeting to stage the final confrontation. She insisted that the entire command staff, plus representatives from the police union and selected officers, be present. Superintendent Ortega, anxious but supportive, granted her request. Whispers rippled through the department that Ebony had something big to reveal. Martin tried to brace himself, telling his allies it was just another stunt, but deep down, An ominous knot tightened in his gut. The meeting took place in the precinct's largest conference room. Rows of chairs lined the space, a projector screen at the front. The tension was palpable, even the air felt heavier. Ebony stood at a small podium, a stack of files and a laptop before her. Martin sat in the second row, arms folded tightly, every muscle wound like a spring. Ebony began by outlining her investigation's scope, a broad inquiry into officers with repeated allegations of misconduct. She spoke calmly, methodically, citing statistics and legal precedents that underpinned the urgency of her work. Then she shifted gears. "I'm here to present conclusive evidence of grave misconduct by one officer in particular." A flurry of murmurs broke out, and Martin clenched his jaw. Ebony paused for effect, letting the hush settle before continuing. She introduced Officer Carla Diaz, who stood up from a seat in the back. Carla's gaze flicked across the crowd, finally resting on Martin with an almost sorrowful look. "Officer Diaz courageously provided significant information," Ebony said, turning her attention back to the crowd, which led to an undercover operation. Ebony clicked a button on her laptop and the projector lit up. Audio files began to play, capturing Martin's voice from the convenience store incident. The room fell silent, except for the harsh words crackling through the speakers. Martin's vitriol was undeniable. Racial slurs, threats, the refusal to check basic evidence, all documented. When the audio ended, a stunned stillness pervaded the room, punctuated only by hushed gasps. Ebony followed up with dashcam footage from the squad car, further corroborating Carla's testimony. The visuals, combined with the audio, painted a damning portrait of Martin's conduct. It was an unvarnished glimpse of the racism and abuse he'd long concealed behind his polished persona. Superintendent Ortega's face was grim, and union representatives looked like they wanted to vanish. Martin tried to speak, but the lump in his throat made him stutter. All eyes were upon him. Some showed shock, others outrage, and a few, especially those who'd suspected his behavior, wore expressions of vindication. Finally, Martin rose to his feet. He tried to dismiss the evidence as an isolated incident, a misinterpretation of his words. But Ebony countered by unveiling a slideshow, a series of old complaints, interviews with victims, and internal memos that showed a persistent pattern. She reminded everyone that internal affairs had cross-checked the authenticity of every file. There was nowhere left for Martin to hide. As the revelations piled up, Martin's bravado shattered. His attempt to shift blame to Ebony for having a personal vendetta rang hollow. His voice cracked under the weight of incontrovertible evidence. Shouts broke out. A few officers demanded his immediate resignation. Others just shook their heads in shame. After a brief, chaotic back and forth, Superintendent Ortega stepped in, announcing that Martin Harding was officially placed on administrative leave, pending a full disciplinary hearing. In that charged moment, Ebony locked eyes with Martin. Neither spoke, but the message was clear. The teenage girl he had once dismissed had become the arbiter of his fate, and she had just delivered the first crushing blow of a well-deserved comeuppance. The disciplinary hearing against Martin Harding took place 2 weeks later in a stark, wood-paneled chamber typically reserved for internal reviews. Word of the scandal had spread like wildfire, and the city's media outlets reported daily updates. Protesters gathered outside the police headquarters, demanding Martin's immediate termination and broader reforms. Inside the building, Ebony and her team prepared their case meticulously. Martin arrived wearing a crisp suit, flanked by a defense attorney who specialized in representing police officers. The attorney tried to argue that Martin's language, while inappropriate, was taken out of context. He insisted Martin was a dedicated officer who sometimes had to make tough calls under stressful circumstances. But Ebony's legal acumen and the mountain of evidence she presented systematically dismantled those arguments. Former victims took the stand, recounting harrowing encounters with Martin. Many described feeling helpless and terrified as he hurled insults, used unnecessary force, and ignored their basic rights. Whistleblowers from within the department corroborated these accounts, detailing how Martin had manipulated paperwork and coerced colleagues into backing his version of events. Each testimony added another nail to the coffin of Martin's defense. Ebony's closing argument was concise yet powerful. She reminded the panel that the badge was meant to be a symbol of trust, integrity, and respect for the law. Officer Harding has repeatedly betrayed the values he was sworn to uphold, she said, her voice steady. And that betrayal has harmed not just individuals but the community's faith in law enforcement. When the panel adjourned to deliberate, Martin sat slumped in his chair, sweat beading at his forehead. The attorney tried to console him, but even he seemed resigned to defeat. After just an hour, the panel reconvened. The verdict was unanimous. Martin Harding was guilty of multiple counts of misconduct, including racial bias, falsifying reports, and abuse of authority. The recommended sentence was immediate dismissal from the police force and a referral for potential criminal prosecution. The gavel's echo rang through the chamber, sealing Martin's fate. Outside, the news spread instantly, cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions at Ebony, Martin, and anyone else they could reach. Martin stumbled out of the building, ignoring the barrage of microphones. In a single moment, his carefully curated image, his shining reputation, connections, and manipulative tactics vanished. All that remained was a disgraced ex-cop facing not only legal repercussions, but also the scorn of a city hungry for justice. For Ebony, the moment was both triumphant and sobering. She knew that removing Martin Harding was just one step in a much broader journey toward reform. Systems rarely change overnight, and her role as head of internal affairs meant she would face countless more battles. Still, witnessing Martin's downfall felt like the karmic resolution to a personal chapter of her life that had started in handcuffs and ended in vindication. The following day, Ebony's office was flooded with messages, some congratulatory, others hateful. Superintendent Ortega commended her work publicly, while politicians who once kept their distance now wanted to be associated with her. Community leaders praised her courage. Behind the scenes, though, she knew the real work was ongoing, restructuring oversight protocols, implementing better training, and creating an environment where the next Martin Harding would find it impossible to thrive. In the quiet of her office that evening, Ebony allowed herself a moment to reflect. She remembered being that frightened teen, pinned under the weight of Martin's prejudice. How far she'd come. The taste of justice was bittersweet, knowing how many people had suffered along the way. But it was a new day for Chicago, a day that hinted at the possibility of true accountability. The cycle of oppression had been disrupted, and there was no turning back. Thank you for joining me on this intense journey of power, prejudice, and poetic justice. Martin Harding's downfall wasn't just the end of one cop's twisted reign, it was a beacon of hope for everyone who believes in fairness and accountability. If this story moved you, made you think, or sparked conversations about integrity in law enforcement, then I encourage you to keep this dialogue alive. Share it with your friends, your family, and your community. Let's ensure that people like Ebony Townsend, champions of justice, continue to rise and transform broken systems. So, if you found yourself rooting for Ebony and want to see more stories that shed light on courage, resilience, and reform, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your network, and subscribe to my channel. Every click helps spread the message that real change is possible, one story at a time.